This is the Reluctantly Independent podcast, and this is my interview with Trevor Miller, board chair of MAPS Canada and the co-founder of Liberty Root Ibogaine Therapy. Yeah, so you're the co-founder of Liberty Root Ibogaine Therapy in Vancouver, and before we talk about what the organization does, I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about how you were first exposed to Ibogaine and what led you to start working with it therapeutically with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of a convoluted story, but post 9/11, so post September 11th, 9/11, I was doing what I did pre 9/11, which was basically wake up in the morning. I would turn on I'm in Canada here, so the CTV News Network. I would have that blaring in the background while I got ready, and I would read 2 or 3 newspapers a day. I would get super pissed off at all the things that I read about the state of the world. And that was that. And then 9/11 happened. I turned on the TV, saw a couple planes hit a couple buildings. And then it was really a couple of months after that, I was still doing the same thing, turning on the TV, reading the newspapers, getting miserable. And I call it an act of grace. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, I'm like, holy shit, I'm driving myself crazy here. And I realized then that what the media does, and they've become even better at since 9/11, is they basically turn us into passive yet obsessive observers of all that is wrong in the world. So we don't do anything about it. We just get super pissed off at it all. So I decided to go on a media fast. So it was, 2001. It was before we got all our news on the internet. So maybe a little easier to do. I just turned off the TV and stopped reading those 3 or 4 newspapers every day. And at the same time, I said, all right, well, I'll put down this stuff, but what am I going to do to then try and make the world a bit better place? So I live in Vancouver here, and Vancouver has a neighborhood called the Downtown East Side, and it is known as the poorest postal code in Canada because it literally is the poorest postal code in Canada. In the most recent census, that was the case again. And it's really 4 or 5 square blocks of really abject poverty, and you can see it. It is, you drive through the downtown east side, and it's unlike driving through any other place in North America, really. There's an open air drug market. There is just real visible signs of suffering. So kind of rightly or wrongly, I decided to look at what I could do to try and help this neighborhood. I say rightly or wrongly because I really had no business trying to do anything like that. I didn't go to school for social work or anything, but, there's kind of this bleeding wound in my new city. I had newly moved to Vancouver, and I thought I would do what I could to help it. So I basically just started going down there every day, looking at it with fresh eyes, trying to just do a lot of research. In 2005, that turned into me starting a company. I printed a bunch of t-shirts, and I was going to sell the t-shirts to try and raise some money to help the downtown east side, which I did do. But I kind of very quickly saw that I didn't know what I was going to do with the money anyway. So long story a bit shorter is I then worked on cruise ships for a little while. I met the woman that I married. We moved back to Vancouver in 2009. And once I had a job on land again and was a bit stable, I decided to go back to the downtown east side. And I met with VANDU, the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. Anne Livingston is one of the founders of that. And I was meeting with her, kind of picking her brain on what I might try and do to help the neighborhood. And the whole time I was speaking to her, there was a binder on the wall behind her that said Ibogaine on it. And I said, what about Ibogaine? She said, actually, I have people calling me looking for that all the time because her name was tied to a now defunct Ibogaine providing website. And so people were calling her for that. And I had heard of Iboga before. My history with psychedelics is, I was 14 years old the first time I took LSD. I had no idea of the therapeutic value of it, or that it had ever been touted as a therapeutic tool, but at the same time, I really felt as though there was something this drug was telling me that I remember walking through a field with some friends at one point. We're all on acid, and I said, "This is what adults forget that has made the world so screwed up." So, I intuitively got that therapeutic value out of it. But then around that 2001 time, actually, I was hanging out at a shop here in Vancouver called the Urban Shaman, the original Urban Shaman here in town on Commercial Drive. And I had heard of Iboga during those early days. It was kind of ironically, I heard about it and said, "Ooh, I'll never be trying that one, that's for sure," because I heard it was expensive and it puts you on like a 36-hour long trip. I'm like, no thanks. But then in 2009, I'm speaking to Anne, and I said, "What about Ibogaine?" And she says, "Actually, I've got people calling for that all the time." So I kind of followed that thread. I found a supplier of Ibogaine. I gave it to a couple people, and quickly, maybe not quickly enough, realized that I had no idea what I was doing with it. So I stopped giving it to people. And a couple years passed, and I got a call one morning from my friend Anne saying, "Hey, did you know there was an Ibogaine Providers Conference in town?" And I didn't, but it was the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance was meeting in Vancouver over the course of 4 days. And she said, "I put your name on the list as a provider. You should go down." So I spent the next 3 or 4 days with people who are still my very good friends. And I met the guy who became my business partner, Gareth Moxie, and he did know what he was doing with Ibogaine. He had been apprenticed in Mexico and helped on a bunch of treatments. He really wanted to work with the medicine here in Vancouver. I said, let's see what we can do. So the phone rang, and it was a 28-year-old and 32-year-old brothers plus the 28-year-old's girlfriend, and we treated them over the course of a month kind of thing, a couple of weekends, and it went really well. We said there's obviously a need for this here in town, so we decided to move out of the downtown core. We moved to White Rock, which is about 40 minutes south of here, rented a 3-bedroom townhome, used the master bedroom as the treatment room. We would bring one person in at a time for a 7-day protocol was how we worked then. I now tend to work with a 10-day protocol. And yeah, we treated about 75 people through there over the course of a couple of years. All the doors really opened for us to make a great team around us. Dr. Gabor Mate, who's kind of a rock star of addictions docs. He wrote the book In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost. We met him early on, and he said he would do whatever he could to help us. He introduced us to a physician who could work with us because he was no longer licensed. So she would write any prescriptions that we needed. We had great registered nurses who were working with us. And yeah, like I said, about 75 people over a couple of years in that first place, and we graduated to a larger place. We could take up to 3 people at a time. And yeah, now I've treated about 200 people in total. And yeah, Ibogaine we work with mostly opioid addicts, and it has a very high success rate compared to other treatments in treating opioid addiction. It really helps people get through withdrawal, get off the drugs without having to go through the painful withdrawal. It seems to be able to press a reset and get people through that. So, anecdotally, Ibogaine seems to have anywhere from kind of a 40 to 60% success rate long-term in helping people interrupt their addictions.
And have you had any personal experience with Ibogaine?
Yeah, I try and take it at least once a year kind of thing. So I've had 3, 4, 5 large doses, maybe 4 or 5 for sure, large doses. And then I microdose with it every now and then as well.
And I know that psychedelic experiences are often pretty difficult to describe in a way that the person being spoken to will really get the gist of it. But that said, could you give it a shot and try to describe what a typical Ibogaine experience is like?
For sure. So it's called oniric, which means as related to dreams. So it is very dreamlike. It is generally about a 36-hour long thing. And the way that breaks down is, a person doesn't move around very much, especially in the detox situation. This medicine has been used ceremonially for centuries in Africa, and they've got a different way of working with it. And I do have friends who have been to Africa and trained in that Bwiti way, which is the name of the tradition in Gabon and Cameroon that work with it. So there's a lot more going on in that Bwiti context, but the way we work with it is a person is generally in bed for pretty much the whole time. The first 12 hours that the medicine is in somebody, that's kind of when all the bells and whistles happen, as it were, all the psychedelic bells and whistles. That's when you might, be journeying to some past life or past lives, or there's lots of, it's definitely an ancestor medicine that seems to come up a lot. So yeah, it's hard to say, but people dream through, various things. What's a good example? With any kind of psychedelic psychotherapy, it seems to be able to recontextualize past traumatic events. So for example, maybe something really shitty happened with your mom when you were 5 years old. And when you take a psychedelic plant medicine, you maybe relive that experience, but perhaps from a bit more of a third person context. And you look at it and you can see, oh, you know what? I can see mom was having a really bad day that day. Actually, mom was having a bad week and a bad year. So maybe I don't have to hold her to as much account as I was, and maybe I can forgive her. And through that forgiveness, a recontextualization happens and the trauma is no longer there. So I think psychedelics in general, and maybe especially Ibogaine, they are almost like forgiveness medicines. They really help you wipe the slate clean or press reset, as it were, on a lot of the gimpy processes that might not be serving you. So that's kind of the first 12 hours. And then I always warn my clients, the worst part of an Ibogaine journey, in my opinion, is the fact that you get super tired, but you're not able to sleep. So that's kind of the next 12 to 24 hours. You've got a lot of time to sit there, think about your life, think about the journey that just happened, think about the insights you've been given. And, that's a lot of time to be with yourself, especially in light of what you might have been up to in the past few years leading up to this, in the kind of throes of an addiction. So it seems like, that might help people integrate their experience a little bit more, that 12 to 24 hours in the end. But then eventually a person will get a bit of sleep, and Ibogaine's really physically taxing. You might feel like you've been hit by a truck for a few days, even a week or two afterwards if you were detoxing. But yeah, you ultimately feel like $1 million when all of that wears off. It seems as though the Ibogaine gets turned into a metabolite called noribogaine, which is stored in the fat cells of the body, and then slowly gets released over the course of the next 2 or 3 months. So it's often said that a person feels like they're on a bit of a pink cloud after taking this medicine. And I always advise my clients that you really want to use that time where you're feeling great to get your life moving in a great direction, get a lot of momentum going in a healthier direction.
And could you walk me through what a typical treatment plan for your clients would be? Like, how are they expected to prepare for the experience, and what should they expect during and after the treatment?
For sure. So we work with our clients, we work with them quite a bit before they even arrive. There was a supplementation protocol that we generally put people on. The application process itself, we're asking a lot about what your aftercare strategy might look like. We make sure that they've got something in place for afterwards. I generally tell my clients, look, and I tell them this kind of for their own best interest, to really, do what I can to make that easier on them, is to say, look, you're basically auditioning for this medicine every step of the way until you arrive in my front door, and then I'm going to take responsibility for you. You're really auditioning, and I say that just because somebody that's in the throes of addiction, the more, of course, they're in the throes of addiction, and that's a hard life, but the more you can kind of get your things together and prepare and know that you've done good work coming into a situation like this. I always say, like, Ibogaine's almost like Santa Claus. It knows whether or not you've been naughty or nice coming into the treatment. And that's because ultimately you know whether or not you've been preparing for this properly. So I really try and encourage people to, even though they probably haven't been all that good to themselves in the years leading up to this experience, to really do what they can to, have compassion and take care of themselves for the few weeks leading into the experience. And then the aftercare is very important. The way we work is we have a 10-day program, and there's only so much we can include in a 10-day program. So we really do focus on making sure that there is some kind of an aftercare strategy in place, and that looks different for everybody. Some people are really repulsed by something like a 12-step meeting. Some people don't mind the 12-step meeting at all. They would just prefer to handle the detox before having to sit through a meeting like that. Some people check into, further treatment after. Some people do nothing. That's the funny thing, is I'm constantly looking for kind of this special sauce that's going to make every treatment work. But for some people, they do everything. You put everything in place. They've got every advantage, and they still end up relapsing. Whereas some people, they don't do anything. They're just totally, they're just, the line has been drawn. They're done with this drug as long as they can get detox. So we detox them. They don't do anything else except do that detox, and they manage to see complete success. So it's hard to nail what that special sauce is, but I'm always looking for it.
Do your clients typically all take the same amount of Ibogaine? And over that 10-day period, do they take it more than once?
Yeah, so it really varies. To some degree, it's based on body weight. To kind of a larger degree, it's based on, how much opioid they're using, and, you really have to feel it out. But the way the 10 days would work generally for an opioid addict is when they come in, we have them meet with our doctor right away. Then our doctor can prescribe morphine, because if somebody is physically addicted to opiates and you don't have that opiate there, then that physical withdrawal is going to start. And that's what we're really trying to avoid by somebody coming to an Ibogaine provider. So we're thankfully able to keep them on morphine for a day or two just to keep them comfortable, get them stabilized. And then we start working with low doses of Ibogaine. So, for example, the way that would look is they wake up in the morning. Rather than taking morphine that morning, we'll go in just with a low dose of Ibogaine. That'll take away the withdrawals for anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. One of the cool things with that, the first time we give an opiate addict medicine, is anybody that's been addicted to opiates, they've experienced dope sickness, and the cure to dope sickness is always dope. So to be able to give somebody who's kind of in that dope sick state a bit of Ibogaine, and within 45 minutes they feel those withdrawals go away from something other than an opiate, you really get the buy-in right then. It's like, oh, cool, this is working. So 4 to 6 hours that first day, then we put them back on morphine. Because the Ibogaine has done some of its work, the morphine, we only need to give them about half as much generally. And then we'll do that for a couple of days. So the next day we'll do another low dose and step them down off as much morphine as possible before the next day, which is when we bring in the registered nurse and do the full flood dose, it's called. So that's kind of the full 36-hour long Ibogaine experience, after which they'll get a decent night's sleep, hopefully, and then if we need to, we can do some smaller booster doses out the other end. But for the most part, the latter half of that 10 days is really just kind of putting yourself back together. We call our post-Ibogaine patients our little hatchlings, because they're a little bit raw, a little bit tender. So we just kind of wear the kid gloves with them for the next few days and get them feeling as good as possible before they leave. And that's a flood dose protocol. There's other things that can be done with lower dose protocols. Another aspect of giving somebody Ibogaine is there is a cardiotoxicity issue with Ibogaine. So you need to get an ECG done before they come, and we look at how their heart looks. And sometimes, it's a prolonged QT interval that Ibogaine always creates a prolonged QT interval. A lot of medicines do. You just don't want to stack one prolonged QT on top of another prolonged QT. So if somebody sends us their EKG and we see that they've got this prolonged QT interval, then I think a lot of Ibogaine providers would just say, sorry, we can't help you. But over the years and working with some great mentors, I've learned some low dose protocols so we can, in conjunction with supplementation and some other things, we can even work with kind of more at-risk clients that way. And the way that works is just taking a kind of like I described for those first 2 days of my 10-day treatment, we'll just do low doses every day and just wean a person off of that opiate over the course of the 10-day period, which can work quite nicely as well.
Yeah, I remember reading, I think a couple of years ago, that the executive director of MAPS Canada, Mark Hayden, stated that he wasn't interested in studying Ibogaine anymore because of those dangers that are associated with it. I know that you're the board chair of MAPS, and so I was wondering, is MAPS currently doing any work whatsoever with Ibogaine?
I know all the ins and outs of that story. So Mark Hayden, who has been one of the biggest supporters of me and my business since day one. So when I first met with Ann Livingston and I asked her about Ibogaine, she said, yeah, I've got people calling for that. Within a few days, I think she was calling her friend Mark Hayden saying, there's somebody in town that's interested in working with Ibogaine. So Mark immediately called me. He said, let's set up a meeting at Vancouver Coastal Health. We'll get a bunch of doctors there. And we did. And it was a great meeting. And I still really wasn't working with the medicine to the degree that I ended up working with it at that point. So once I did start working with it a little bit more, Mark again set up a meeting. This time it was with St. Paul's Hospital, and Evan Wood is kind of the main doc in the addictions field at St. Paul's Hospital. It was him, it was some other MDs, some research assistants, some RNs who were in a room and in a boardroom, and I presented on Ibogaine. And it went really, really well, and they basically said, we're excited to work with you. So we were going to aim to do some real clinical trials or some good studies around Ibogaine. And unfortunately, because of this cardiotoxicity issue, it was determined that they would not be able to get this study past the ethics board at UBC, is who the ethics board that St. Paul's relies upon. So Evan said to me at the time, he's like, Trevor, if aspirin became a new drug at this point, we would not be able to get it past the ethics board. He said it's just tough that way. So we did actually publish a paper at that time. We did a case study on one of my clients. So I co-authored a paper with those guys that did get published. But they kind of put studying Ibogaine on the back burner. So because of that ethics board issue. So kind of fast forward, number one, I think Mark was kind of taken out of context in that quote that was in that CBC article, I think. But ultimately, because I was asked to become the chair of the board for MAPS Canada, and that was great to be offered that. It kind of came out of left field, though. I hadn't thought about it beforehand. It was after the fact. I'd been asked to be on the board. I was asked to be chair of the board. And then I had a talk with Rick Doblin and Mark and said, look, I just got to get clear on this, because I had read that article in CBC as well. I was featured in that article too. So I said, I just got to get clear. I've heard Rick say that you are interested in studying Ibogaine. I've heard Mark say through a newspaper article that you guys aren't interested in studying it anymore. And I said, the only reason I am speaking on behalf of MAPS Canada for anything is because of my involvement with Ibogaine. So where do you guys actually stand on Ibogaine? And Mark came back right away and said, Ibogaine is a psychedelic. MAPS studies psychedelics. We are interested in studying psychedelics. So that was his immediate reply. And then Rick's immediate reply was, we need $2 million to do a phase 1/phase 2 FDA approved safety study that will be done out of University of California, San Francisco. We've got a team ready to go. We want to do this. So that was great news. So that's where it stands right now, is Rick does want to study Ibogaine. We need $2 million. If any of your listeners want to give me $2 million, we can give you lots of great kudos for that. And then here in Canada, where it's at, is we still don't expect that we would be able to get that past UBC ethics board, but we do aim to be working with Ibogaine through something called the Special Access Drug Program. We are actually in the midst of working with, some of those doctors that I've already mentioned to treat a lot of people with this medicine. Now, we can't do an actual clinical trial because the ethics board wouldn't let that pass, but we think we can do an observational study. So as long as we are treating the people, let's study the people that we are treating. It won't be, a clinical trial, which basically takes people off the street and treats them for free, but we will be able to start collecting some data up here in that regard, is our hope.
It's a little interesting to me because Ibogaine is legal in Canada, right? Or at least unregulated, put it that way, maybe?
So it used to be listed as a natural health product. So a natural health product is a program that Canada put together, Health Canada put it together maybe 10 years ago now. It's for things like ginkgo biloba and rhodiola and those kind of supplements. And Ibogaine just got put on that list when they created that list. So for the 4 years that I was running Liberty Root, that was the angle that we took, is we were able to get a hold of it because it was listed as a natural health product. In May of 2017, Health Canada switched Ibogaine and put it onto the prescription drug list, which they needed to do something. A natural health product should not be potentially dangerous, and Ibogaine is. So Health Canada had a decision to make. They could outlaw it, or I like to think it has something to do with some of the interactions I had with Health Canada, which were really good interactions. They got in touch with me a few times, and the people who did get in touch had researched before they called me. They kind of spoke to me with a great deal of respect and were just inquiring as to some of the ins and outs of what we were up to. But when they re-regulated it, they could have outlawed it, and thankfully they didn't. They put it on the prescription drug list, but that doesn't make it immediately available as a prescription. It still needs to go through those phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials we talked about, which will cost, tens of millions of dollars and take tens of years. But in the meantime, as I've said, Health Canada also has this special access drug program, which is similar to the Right to Try program that was started in the States just in the last year, which is basically if you've got an ailment, you've tried everything to beat that ailment that is conventionally available, nothing's worked for you, you want to try something else, then you can use this application to try that something else. So we hope to get permission from Health Canada to use that in a much greater degree in the future here.
In your own practice, I understand that you started in a pretty non-secular kind of fashion, but over time you moved towards incorporating more ceremony and ritual into the treatment. And I'm just wondering what your motivation for that was.
For sure. So, this whole, I'm a pretty spiritual guy. Like in wanting to help the downtown east side, some of that grew out of the fact that, I was starting to kind of awaken spiritually and saw that there's great value in giving back and that we're all one thing. So if any of us are suffering, all of us are suffering. So I was greatly motivated by my own spirituality and taking on this downtown east side project. Once Liberty Root started, I haven't been to Africa. I haven't been trained in the Bwiti ways. We do use Bwiti music through the treatment. We've always done that. But I still say we want the atheist to be comfortable as well, So I, over the years, just developed a bit of a ceremony, and I call it my secular ceremony. I talk about things that are obviously there, and I introduce it almost in a quantum mechanics context. I say, look, the cool thing about ceremony is we can take this huge wave of unlimited potential and we can collapse it to a specific intent. So, when I do the ceremony, the first thing I recognize is the creator. But when I put a caveat in there, I say, when I say creator, I mean the first cause, whatever came first, it had all intelligence in it. It's like an acorn contains a whole oak tree. Within that first cause, that was the seed of everything that we know, including all intelligence. And when I call upon intelligence, that's when I'm calling upon the healing energy. Because if I cut my arm, I don't have to think about how that arm's going to heal. It just happens. So we're calling on that great intelligence. Then I call in the 7 directions. And I caveat that by saying every human being that has ever been has been cradled in 7 directions. Symbolically, they're represented by north, south, east, west. We've got the direction below us, the earthly direction, and the heavenly direction above us. And then that 7th direction, that inward turn. So we recognize that. And then I recognize the 5 elements. The earth element, the water element, the fire element, the air element, and the Akash, the ether, the Shiva, the great blank empty canvas that everything happens upon. And then I just call upon the ascended masters. If there's any human being who has ever achieved any degree of consciousness and benevolence over what I've got right here, we're calling upon your help. And then I throw it back to the creator. So I just, without culturally appropriating anything, I'm just calling out kind of the basics of what we've all got as humanity available to us, and asking for the highest and best aspect of those things to be with us through whatever the journeying process is. And it seems to go over quite well, even with those atheists.
Yeah, so they typically respond pretty well to the spiritual aspects of the treatment?
For sure, but they definitely do. But I've had more than one person come through Liberty Root and say, yeah, I was an atheist before I got here, and now I know there's a God. So,
do you find that the therapy that goes along with the treatment to be like absolutely necessary, or do people just sometimes tend to respond to it in the same way without it being done in such a controlled therapeutic environment?
I think the controlled environment for Ibogaine is more a safety vehicle than a therapeutic vehicle. Like I tell my clients, I'm not a registered talk therapist. I seem to have a knack for it, but the therapy is really between you and the medicine. And I think that's very true. Even in working with MAPS and learning about the MDMA clinical trials and all of the great therapists who are facilitating that, I have heard it said numerous times that, almost the more trained the therapist is, the more unlearning they need to do, because at the end of the day, these molecules contain all the magic in them. Just give the medicine to people and get out of the way. Be the safety, hold the space in a safe way. But as much as you can, just let that medicine do what it wants to do with the person. The medicine, and then that person's internal healing intelligence as well, which the medicine is really helping release, helping let that internal healer out and do its thing.
And given that you're the board chair of MAPS, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about some of the current projects that MAPS are involved in Canada.
For sure. So, number one, I'll say I'm happy to speak as a representative of Liberty Root and Ibogaine. Number two, anything I say on behalf of MAPS is not on behalf of MAPS. It's just I'm the chair of the board. It's a volunteer position, and don't take anything that I say about MAPS as gospel. Speak to Rick Doblin or Mark Hayden about that. But there's lots of cool things going on, like the phase 3 clinical trial for MDMA is starting. There's numerous sites. There's multiple sites in Canada for that. There's multiple sites in the US. There's sites in Israel. But the way that works is the phase 2 study was so successful. It, more than 75% of the people who went through that study using MDMA to treat post-traumatic stress disorder no longer qualified as having post-traumatic stress disorder. So the FDA gave that gave the phase 3 study breakthrough therapy status, which means they're really getting rid of a lot of the red tape to help facilitate bringing this drug to market as soon as possible. So we've got a site that's started, and they've done their open label client, so people that knew that they were getting MDMA, so that the therapist can kind of practice giving people the MDMA. That's been done. So now they are screening people, and we'll be starting the phase 3 here in Canada pretty soon. And I believe there's a site in Montreal for that as well. There is a study that Mark Hayden is doing around microdosing. It is generally considered almost gospel that you don't give psychedelics to people with schizophrenia or bipolar or things like that. But there was actually a gentleman who approached Mark Hayden who does have schizophrenia and has noticed over the years that low dosing LSD and other psychedelics actually helps his disorder quite a bit. So he's got some money, this guy. So he has financed a study to look into this a little deeper to see if any other people might actually have seen, good results around some of those disorders that we generally consider we don't put psychedelics on top of. So he's doing that. There is a really cool study that's just starting. We've just got initial funding on to study MDMA around eating disorders, which is a very promising avenue as well. I think we'll see great results in that. Another one is a study on accidental macrodosing. So people who have taken way too much LSD, for example, and there was a particular incident where a bunch of people accidentally took like 10 times too much LSD. And some of the people saw really great benefits from it. I think including somebody who was diagnosed with, and don't quote me, but it was something like bipolar disorder. I think it was bipolar, actually. And after this super macro dose, they felt kind of completely healed and better from that. So Mark's kind of searching out some of those people to put that kind of study together as well. Those are the ones that I can think about. Some of the studies that I'm keen to get going would be, how about MDMA to treat physician burnout? Because physicians, sadly, those who are tasked with the healing of all of us, have a higher suicide rate than any other profession right now. So imagine a study to treat doctor burnout, which to me would be a really great little Trojan horse of a study. Let's get some MDMA into the physicians so that they can see how wonderful these medicines can work for people.
Do you foresee the full legalization of psychedelic drugs happening anytime soon? And if so, do you think it should be just for therapeutic or spiritual purposes, or do you think that there is a place for them recreationally?
The only reason I got here is because of my recreational use of psychedelics, or I wouldn't have had any interest. So I think there's, again, set and setting really matter. The more you can prepare and have kind of a well thought out place to do medicine, the better. But, I've had a great time with taking a bunch of mushrooms around a campfire with a bunch of beer,
Yeah.
So, the insights happen then. And with all things considered, yes, there's horrible ways to do these drugs, but even when they're done in the most horrible ways, they often don't injure a person all that badly. They might have a bad experience. Some people do have, more serious, almost psychotic breaks, but those are very few and far between. Like magic mushrooms, for example, is literally the safest drug on the scale of drugs.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and even with bad trips, it seems like there's a lot of learning that can be done from those, supposed negative experiences, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I was just saying to somebody yesterday that often the grace of those horrible experiences. You're stuck in this hell-like experience for what seems like an eternity, and oh my God, and it's never going to end. And sometimes, even if you don't get any other advantage out of that experience, just coming back to a normal baseline level of consciousness is like, oh yeah, I'm so grateful for normal baseline consciousness, you know? So that can be good medicine in and of itself. But then some of the more powerful negative experiences aren't necessarily negative at all. It's exactly what the medicine's up to.
Mm-hmm. And are you still doing work in the downtown east side? Or is that something that's on the back burner at the moment?
Well, no, kind of everything I do is around that. Ibogaine's never been my end game. Psychedelics has never been my end game. Trying to end as much needless suffering on Earth in my lifetime has been my end game. And the downtown east side seems like a good vehicle for that, or it has historically in my mind. The way I think about it is there is such abject poverty. There is such a high degree of suffering. There is so many problems that are being manifest down there. At the same time, there is a great sense of community. There is a lot of support. There is a lot of hope. But my kind of attitude has been, if we can do something to massively affect change in a positive way in an area like that, then there's really hope for the rest of us, is the way I look at it. So I actually met with a downtown east side doctor last Wednesday. He is the chief doc at the safe injection site, and I had a great meeting with him. He said, it's good to speak to you. He said, ideally, Ibogaine would have more studies behind it, but the fact that you have treated 200 people and, I can see the integrity that you hold yourself with and the way that you're speaking about this, he's like, you've got a pretty compelling story. So he actually mentioned that there is a public hearing at City Hall the first week of February around some issues like this, that he strongly suggested that I go and speak about Ibogaine there. So it seems like I've got a really big, beautiful team coming together to really do something on the downtown east side. Because the other thing is we started Liberty Route. We treated people who could afford to come in. I think our first price was $6,500 for the 7-day treatment. And actually, no, it was $6,500 for the 10-day treatment near the end. But at the same time, we would set aside money to do what we can to help residents of the downtown east side. So the first version of that project was VANDU is the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. They have a membership that basically they teach their membership harm reduction techniques through meetings. So you can go to a meeting, you can get stipended. So they pay $5 per meeting for people to come to now. And, maybe learn to use, if you're going to use IV drugs, use the needle in a safer way kind of thing. So those kind of meetings. So early on in my mission to do what I can in that neighborhood, I bumped into VANDU and started speaking to their membership and their leadership. And once I was ready to start this kind of downtown east side Ibogaine program, I went into VANDU. I spoke to their membership over the course of the week. So I probably spoke to about 300 people saying, look, this is what Ibogaine is. If anybody's interested in doing this to overcome their addiction, we're interested in helping you. What you would need to do is come to meetings that we're going to hold. We're going to hold a meeting once a week for about 90 days leading into this. Over the course of that 90 days, we'll get to know each other. We'll get medical tests done. We'll make sure that you've got a good aftercare strategy. We'll make sure that you've got a good housing arrangement. And I consistently had about 5 people show up to this meeting every day for about 3 months. And at the end, though, there was one guy left, Aaron, who really wanted the treatment. He jumped through all the hoops that I put in front of him. He had a housing arrangement sorted out. So we brought him in for 7 days. We gave him the medicine. We helped him detox off all the things that he was on. And that went really well. And unfortunately, once he left us, the housing arrangement that we had set up fell apart. So he was in a shelter pretty shortly thereafter. And he did end up relapsing. But we stayed in touch with him. We kept working with him. He kept showing a great, want and desire to improve his life. So we did eventually bring him in for another treatment, and that went well. And really, long story short, is he's now just about 2 years clean. He has a job that he loves. He has an apartment that he likes. And the coolest thing is, it's one thing to help somebody overcome their addiction. It's another thing to help somebody overcome the poverty mindset that might be holding them back. So Aaron was very open to reading all the books that I suggested, books like Think and Grow Rich or The Science of Getting Rich, things that really help you kind of tweak your mental state to allow for greater potential to come into your life. And we're in this kind of anti-capitalist moment in society right now. So if you don't like the term rich, you can say think and grow into whatever the heck you would want out of life, or the science of getting whatever you would like in your life. So these are really books on manifestation. I think they're spiritual books, actually. Chapter 3 in Think and Grow Rich is a chapter on faith. So Aaron really absorbed all that stuff. And the coolest thing is he called me in March of this year, I think. He's like, Trevor, I got $5,000 saved up and I want some investment advice. So just, as good as that could have gone, it has gone. So I'm actually speaking February 16th at UBC here. Gabor Mate will be on stage as well. And I have the good, the honor of bringing Aaron as well. Aaron's going to speak at that event and tell his story on February 16th. So that was kind of that version 1 of the project. And as soon as we're kind of ramped up and have the permission we'd like to work with Ibogaine again, we aim to do another version of that project and really do what we can to get in and help that neighborhood again.
And was Aaron's response to the drug typical, would you say? Or, I know it's not like a miracle cure for addiction. It doesn't work for everybody.
With Ibogaine, within that 10-day period, if you're addicted to opiates, I won't send you home until that physical addiction has been cut. Like, by the time you leave in that 10 days, you are no longer physically addicted to opiates. And along with that, the reset seems to get pressed on the cravings. It seems to really just press reset on everything. But then, once you leave, you've then got decisions to make. So some people do end up relapsing. Sometimes if a person does relapse, they realize that I've got to go back to Ibogaine because it's not as though the Ibogaine failed them. It's just that they didn't keep the ball rolling in the right direction, perhaps after the Iboga. So some people have 1, 2, 3. I think I treated one guy 4 times. I said to him on that 4th time, I'm like, dude, I think you like hanging out with us too much. You're not coming back. But it works. Like it works to detox somebody. It gives an opioid addict in particular a leg up on their situation that they're not going to get elsewhere, from what I've seen.
Oh, that's great, man. Well, it sounds like you're doing some really awesome work. This was a really informative chat, man. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, David. Thanks so much for thinking of me and reaching out.